Good morning, everybody. My name is David Roos, and I'm the Director of Libraries for Westminster City Council. And I'm delighted to be here with you this lunchtime, partly because it's Google, and I think it's really great to dispel myths and stereotypes, isn't it? Because public libraries have a lot of myths and stereotypes, and I think Google does as well. So between us, we can break some of those down. And I think the biggest stereotype to break down is that Google is only interested in information and online stuff. But here you are, a reading group, a books-related group. That's absolutely phenomenal. And public libraries are just about boring old irrelevancies from the 19th century. And hopefully some of my colleagues and I will dispel that myth for you. What I'd like to do is just say a couple of things about Westminster's libraries. I've got a very short video to show you about the library service and what we're doing here, which I hope will stimulate your interest. And then I'd like to say something about the National Year of Reading, which we are in, and we're indeed coming to the end of, and introduce our guest speaker for this afternoon, Barbara Ewing. Libraries in Westminster play a major role in early literacy, in adult literacy, and in positive things for young people to do, positive things for older people to do. And in Westminster, we get 3 million people coming through our doors every year. I know that's nothing by comparison with Google Hits, but it's a lot of people in one small city. We also get about 2 million hits a year on our website, and that's growing rapidly. Libraries are a very relevant resource to 21st century economies of all sorts, because it's not only what we do for young people and older people, the literacy agenda, which is so important, but also what we do to support small businesses through our business information services, what we do to support the local economy. And at the moment, as you all know, the economy is kind of wobbling a bit. I don't know what the Chancellor is going to say this afternoon, but public libraries, again, are contributing to economic recovery through stuff we do with adults around developing their skills, taking them out of poverty, taking them out of worklessness. I've got a short video that I want to show you, which kind of illustrates that in a very Westminster-specific way. How many of you actually belong to Westminster's libraries? Great. 2. You've all been given a form, I think, and it is free. But hopefully this short video clip will stimulate and inspire you to explore what's available. It lasts about 5 minutes, assuming I press the right button.
If it's been a while since you last visited one of Westminster's libraries, you'll be amazed at what you've been missing. We've got more than 1 million books in stock and buy in 100,000 new titles each year, making sure that we've got something for everyone. We've got all the books you want to read, from modern-day favourites and celebrity authors to the literary giants of the past, everything you'd expect to find in high street bookshops, even the very latest releases.
So, you've read the book, now you want to see the film. Well, you've come to the right place. From Hollywood to Bollywood and beyond, we're more than a match for your local video store. We get new releases in the same time they do, but ours are cheaper to rent. We've got all your favourite TV shows on DVD too. Comedy classics, family favourites, and natural history. You need never be stuck for something to watch again.
With loads of great stuff like free PC access, Wi-Fi, and comfy chairs, our libraries are great places to come and hang out for a few hours. Along with our books, you've also got newspapers and magazines, music and audiobooks, language courses, and much, much more.
It gives you a better insight into what you just read, and it's brilliant. They don't make me feel stupid even when I'm being stupid.
Whether it's term time or the school holidays, there's always something fun going on at Westminster's libraries.
Sitting down and reading isn't for everybody, particularly when they're young. They want to be involved physically with it, and involving them physically is another way of accessing stories.
As a parent, when you've got 1, 2, 3 children, it's great to be able to let them loose and not have to panic about the noise and the mess.
The kids area is your space, and we want you to enjoy it. So that means we don't mind about a bit of noise, and we're always up for trying out new things. So if you think we should set up a comics club or a high school musical group, tell us.
And you could choose any book you ever want, and it's just a really great place to come.
If you're 11 to 19 and you've got one of these, you're entitled to 20% off the hire charges of all computer games, music and films. We haven't forgotten about you grown-ups either. Westminster's libraries are a great place for the whole community. There are all sorts of opportunities for you to learn new skills, brush up on your CV, or make new friends in a warm and welcoming environment.
This class is pretty good. I improve my English.
Now we know it isn't always easy to find time to use the library, particularly in this city. That's why we've made our libraries easier and more convenient to use than ever before. These self-service machines are perfect when you're in a hurry. You just scan your items in or out and go. You can also use them to reserve and renew books, pay fees and search our stock. You can even access the library from home. Our website is a goldmine of really useful stuff for learning or leisure. There's all the help you could need for homework with loads of links to other great sites. Or if you just need to renew your books or want to look at what to read next, it's all at your fingertips, 24/7. So now you know what we do, you just need to know where we are. There are 11 lending libraries across Westminster. Joining any one gives you access to all of them. The Archive Centre, the Westminster Reference Library and the Marylebone Information Service are great resources for anyone looking for information on a wide range of subjects, from tracing family history to setting up your own business.
So I hope that gives you some idea of what we're trying to do to dispel the myth and change the image of public libraries in Westminster. We don't mind noise, we have lots of books, but we have lots of computers, lots of things for families of all ages to get involved with. Now, the National Year of Reading is the focus of this year. It's a government-inspired initiative very much aimed at promoting reading because of the major challenges around literacy. This country is falling badly behind other countries, both for adult literacy and child literacy. And so the National Year of Reading has been about this big push to get everyone involved. And one of the key elements that we've adopted in Westminster is the concept of one book for Westminster. We wanted everyone to read one book. Now, we didn't really mind which book they read, but we thought it would be quite nice to have a focus on one particular book. And through the national scheme, working with the Reading Agency, we've been working with Barbara Ewing, who's here today. Now, Barbara is a Westminster resident and a very successful actress and author. And she's part of the Reading Agency's 149 authors scheme. That's an author for every public library service in the country. And her recent book, The Mesmerist, which I hope some of you have read, is set in early Victorian and Edwardian Westminster and Camden, I suppose. And it's what we now call Theatreland. It's the part of the city where all the great theatres started and where in that Victorian and Edwardian time it was a rich and ripe area in all sorts of ways, and I think Barbara's captured that beautifully in her book, The Mesmerist. So I'm delighted to invite Barbara to address us here now this afternoon. Barbara.
I was told I could close this down, so I will. Have to do anything else? Two things. I'd like to thank Westminster Libraries for, of course, for choosing the Mesmerist. I mean, what fun for me. It is really good fun. I'm going around all these libraries and talking about the book to book groups who've read the book. And so it's a wonderful, they talk to me about the characters and all those things that have been inside my head come out. And I do live in central London. I live near Oxford Circus. And the book is set in central London, just very early Victorian, and in fact back to the turn of the century, around about 1800, as some of the things happened that are in the book. And it's my third historical novel. I am, as some of you know, an actress. And as I got older, I noticed there were less parts for women. And I thought, men are in their prime playing Ivanov and Macbeth, and I'm playing the mother and things like that. So I thought, I've got to be able to do something else as well. So that's why I started writing. And one of the first books I wrote was called The Actresses, and it was about what happened to middle-aged and aging actresses, and I set it in London in the present day. And I had to turn it into a bit of a bonk buster because no one's really interested in middle-aged women, but they were by the time I'd finished, let me tell you. And then I haven't dealt with actresses from then on. I've dealt with 1950s New Zealand because I was born in New Zealand. I've dealt with a cholera epidemic in the 1850s in London, all the water and all how the water companies were so evil and just put the water into the Thames and took it back again. I've written about boats crossing the world with people on them to try and start new lives in other countries. I've written about Egypt. I've written about the Rosetta Stone when it was found. So The Mesmerist is my third historical novel, so I'm kind of getting the hang of it. And I thought I'd talk to you a bit about research of historical novels. And I'm ever so glad to be talking to people in Google, because I have to tell you that I thought that Google was up in the sky and that it had sort of things coming down. And here I am in an office in London, which I had to sign in and do all sorts of googly things to get here. So it's very, very nice for me to meet people who are actually reading books in Google, and I'm very, very glad to be here. So I thought, how can I interest you? And I thought, why not tell you about the thrillingness and the seduction of historical research. Now, you may think that's a kind of contradiction in terms, but it's not. It is so, so thrilling. And The Mesmerist in particular, the plot was changed because of my research. I'd started out with one idea, but once I started researching the subject of mesmerism, I had to change my plot. I mean, it's terribly exciting. Now, there are 2 points of contention about historical novels that I think we should just briefly touch on. One is between some historians and some historical novelists. Some historians say, oh, you don't understand, you just take a 21st century psyche and you stick it in there in the 19th century or the 18th century, and you don't understand. I see their point, because it is true that our psyches are different in many ways from people in the 18th and 19th centuries. However, it is my belief that there are certain basic things like love, like death, like children and birth, like loneliness. And these things, I think, are eternal things. And I think it's very, very patronizing to say those people didn't feel like we did. Shakespeare proves my point, I think. He says things, and sometimes you can read something of Shakespeare, it just goes, yes. And I think it's because those basic things he understood about. So that's my first point. I disagree partially with some of the historians who get very tight-lipped about what we do. I also, however, get very tight-lipped about some historical novels because people are lazy. They have an idea for a plot and they just plonk it in to the beginning of the 19th century. And they take no notice at all that there's been a French Revolution, or that the Prince of Wales, who became George IV, was so unpopular that the monarchy was nearly demolished here, that the church was frightened about what happened in France that might happen in England. They don't take any notice of all those things, and then they just put a story in. I very much object to that. And so I'm not that kind of historical writer. I take it very, very seriously. And I have 3 background kinds of research that I do first. The first is to know what's happening. If you choose, as I did for my novel about the Rosetta Stone, which is called Rosetta, I chose 1795 because I knew the stone was discovered by Napoleon's troops in 1799, so I knew the Napoleonic Wars were on, I knew there'd been a revolution in France, and I understood I had to find out what was happening in Egypt at that time. You've got to find the background to what you're writing about, and I think it's meretricious and dreadful not to do that. The second background thing I think you have to have is, where do your characters live? Now, here is my wonderful thing for living in central London, because I can just go out and walk the streets, and I walk the streets and I find a house or a place, and I think, now there'd be a very good place for my characters to live in. But I have to find out, A, if the street was there by that name, and B, if it was called that. And you've got to be very careful. You can't have lovers meeting in Regent's Park before Regent's Park was built, which people do. You can't have people, you just can't. You've got to be very, very careful. So I am very, very careful. I walk the streets, and then I go into the British Library and I get out these old maps. And, I have to get on my glasses, and sometimes they give you magnifying things as well. And I look and I see, now, is Great Titchfield Street there for my 1839? Yes, it is there. I can have Great Titchfield Street. And when I was writing Rosetta, when I was writing The Mesmerist, I wanted my heroine, Cordelia Preston, to live in Bloomsbury. So I walked around Bloomsbury thinking, I've got to find, she hasn't got any money, but there is a reason that she's got to live in Bloomsbury. What can I find? So I walked up and down Little Russell Street, and I found these basements with these little steps going down, and the basements were filthy because people could just throw an apple core in, or in those days a chopped bone or a fish head or whatever. So it would be, and what you would see from the windows, just passing feet. And I thought, that's where my heroine will live. And I found the actual place. And I went and had a good old look, and I saw how you got from there to Drury Lane, where the theatres were. So that, where they live, is very important also. And that's good fun. And then thirdly, and here's where I'm really lucky, I want to know what they look like and what they wear. Now, I've worn 18th century and 19th century clothes on stage. I know what it feels like to have a corset on for ages. I know what it feels like to wear a wig and it gets all itchy and horrible. They have all sorts of things in those wigs. I know what it's like to wear gloves and do things with gloves on. I know what it's like to wear a crinoline and try and get through a door. All these things. Now, on stage, of course, you're doing them all very elegantly on the whole. And I learnt to do them very elegantly. But in a theatre, especially in the old theatres in England, there are narrow corridors and small lavatories and tiny dressing rooms. So I know what it's like to really live in these clothes, to have to pick up your bustle or your crinoline or your hoops, or, your corset's too tight and you've got to try and loosen it. It must have been the same for them. If you want to go to the lavatory, it's terribly hard if you're in hoops or a crinoline and the corset comes down too far and it gets over your bum and all sorts of things that you've got to work out. That gives me an in to my characters, as you can imagine. So there's all the background that I believe that a writer of historical novels should do. And then you do the wonderful research of your subject. Now, I set up that I would have 2 old actresses See, I hadn't touched actresses since that book called The Actresses, but I'd have these two aging actresses who couldn't get work, and one of them had an aunt who was a mesmerist. And it is true, there was a Miss Preston who was a mesmerist in Bloomsbury at the turn of the century, around about 1800. I read that in a textbook. So I thought Cordelia can be her niece, so she knows a little bit about it. Her name is Cordelia Preston, and she will know a little bit, just a little bit about mesmerism. And she and her friend Amaryllis Spoons, who lives in Riding House Lane, which is what Riding House Street used to be called, will, because they can't get any work, they have this idea of setting up a Phreno-Mesmerist sort of setup. Phrenology, you know, is that Victorian thing where there was a skull, and this bit would show if you were amative, and this bit would show if you were destructive, and this bit would show if you were good at maths. So they had these marble heads, and so Cordelia and really could learn up all these things. And because Cordelia knows a bit about mesmerism, she can pretend to mesmerize people. But they take it further. They have this really good idea that they put the following advertisement in the newspapers, and it costs them the last of their money, I might tell you, to set this business up. This is Cordelia's idea. Love, the most important decision. Trained, mature Lady Phreno-Mesmerist begs to announce knowledgeable advice given on marriage partners. Do not make a mistake in this big decision. Discretion assured, apply in writing for appointment and terms. And they set up this basement. They have glass stars in the ceiling. They have candlelight. It's all spooky anyway because it's down in a basement. Cordelia buys some scarves. Rilly is the maid. Rilly will let people in and take their half guinea. They're going to charge half a guinea. They want couples to come in so that Cordelia can feel their heads and look into their eyes and say, "You are suited." That's the plan. Rilly will be the maid, take the money, but then she'll run behind a screen and play the flute. Because if she plays the flute, then it gets a sort of atmosphere going, and they think this will be a wonderful thing. So they put the advertisement in the paper, they get the costumes, they're actresses, and they wait. Very slowly, couples trickle down. And it seems to go quite well. Cordelia feels their heads and sort of does the rather spooky things behind her scarves. Rilly takes the money, runs and plays the flute and all that. And the news gets about. But what happens is that single ladies come on their own, and at first they can't understand why. And here is the scene where they understand why single ladies are coming to see them. Miss Lucinda Trudel was perhaps 18. She arrived in Little Russell Street quite alone. She fidgeted when Cordelia held her head. She did not seem interested in where amativeness or parental love might be found according to her phrenological map. She could not say why she'd come or what she wanted. Rilly's flute wafted in hopefully from the back room. "Tell me about your husband-to-be," said Cordelia, somewhat bemused. There was a long silence. Cordelia waited. A ridiculous thought came to her. Was it the name Trudel? She'd heard much worse. She knew an actress who longed to get married because her name was Effie Redbottom. She pulled herself together. "I would like to help you in your choice if I'm able," she said, "but I cannot assist you if you cannot tell me your concerns." "I think he may be deformed," said Miss Trudel. "I do not wish to marry a deformed man." "What is his deformity?" Again Miss Trudel was silent. She looked up at the glass stars that caught the flickering candlelight. "Is it in his face? Is something showing on his face that distresses you?" "No." "Is it something you cannot see?" "Yes." "Is it something you think he is hiding from you?" "Yes." Then you must, I would suppose, ask him about it. The girl blushed red. I cannot. Cordelia felt herself losing patience, reminded herself that patience must now be her strongest virtue. Do you care for this man, Miss Trudel? Yes, but since I've noticed the deformity, I cannot care the same. Cordelia actually heard her swallow. He has a growth. That is a protuberance. Oh, I am so sorry, the poor man. But she struggled very hard to find the words. He pushes the protuberance against me. I do not like it. A light shone. Cordelia bit her lip. Has perhaps your betrothed, what is his name? Mr. Forsyth. Forgive me for this question, but has perhaps Mr. Forsyth been a little forward? I do not know what you mean. Have you allowed Mr. Forsyth to kiss you? She saw the girl's face. Well, it's perfectly natural that he should want to do so. Miss Trudel spoke sulkily. Yes. And is it when Mr. Forsyth is kissing you that this deformity has come to your attention? The girl nodded, her cheeks red. I did state that marriage guidance would be given, thought Cordelia ruefully. Another Schubert song commenced. Miss Trudel, has anyone, your mother perhaps, spoken to you about what happens when a man and woman marry? What do you mean? Well, do you wish to have children? Miss Trudel looked genuinely surprised. Yes, of course. Cordelia plunged in. Do you know how children come to be born? Well, they come when you get married, I know that. Cordelia looked up at the glass stars herself for guidance and suddenly saw the ghost of her Aunt Hester laughing. Miss Trudel, she said firmly, children are not born because you get married. Children are born because men and women who love each other join together. What do you mean? Hell, spite. I mean, the protuberance you have noticed must join to you, enter you. Enter me? Where? Miss Trudel looked like a frightened rabbit. Where? My mouth? Inside your own body, said Cordelia briskly. The girl stood up, shocked beyond belief. I do not believe you. I shall report you. Cordelia tried once more. Perhaps if you could speak to your mother. My mother is a lady, not a vulgar person. Cordelia stood also in her shining new scarves. I think you will find, nevertheless, Miss Trudel, that what I say is true. Such disgusting things cannot be true. I do not believe you. And then she looked at Cordelia and added in a small voice, Enter me where? Cordelia did her best. Very gently she put her hand on her own body. The horror on the girl's face was now absolute. No! She screamed. I do not believe you! The flute stopped mid-bar. Before Cordelia could stop her, Miss Trudel ran out of the room, past the screens, omitting to pay, pulled at the door, and ran up the iron steps and out into Little Russell Street. That's how Cordelia really became so rich and famous, because word got around that they could talk a little about the marriage night, and nobody knew anything about it. And if you think that that's odd, think of, I'm sure some of you have read On Chesil Beach. Now, that was written only 2 years ago, and it was written about the 1950s. And I've been around touring with this book, The Mesmerist, and if I read that part, people come up to me and say, my mother didn't tell me anything, nothing about what would happen when I got married, nothing. So here we are in 1840, and Cordelia and Willie were indeed answering a great need. And my idea was that through their fraudulence, they would become very rich and very famous, okay? But then I started reading about mesmerism, seriously. And I started reading about Dr. Franz Mesmer. And I started having to believe that mesmerism wasn't something that I could just laugh at. I started finding out that mesmerism was used in hospitals as an anesthetic before ether and chloroform. I couldn't believe it. I thought, it's not a joke. I mean, I was going to turn it all into a joke, but my honesty could not allow me to do that, because I found out that it was a real thing that morphed later into hypnotism. Franz Mesmer, after whom it is named, thought energy would come from him to the other person and he would help them with pain or with troubles of some kind. Hypnotism, in fact, was a further development, which all it does, they say, is make energy come from the practitioner to the client, and the practitioner allows the client to feel their own energy, to use their own energy. I was finally persuaded without doubt when I met, and I acknowledge him in the front of the book, I met a doctor from a pain clinic. And he was a medical doctor, and he, in the pain clinic, uses hypnotism to help cancer patients with pain. It is used to this day in hospitals all over the world. And I felt, I can't make a mockery of this. I have to tell it as it is. And so what started off as a kind of a lark, and what I'd also found out was at this very time, coroners' courts were held in the upstairs rooms of pubs. I mean, that's such a gift to a writer. Imagine being upstairs in a pub with all the drinking and the fighting and the yelling, having a coroner with a body and talking about murder and all that. I thought, I've got to have a murder. So by chance, it actually turned into a thriller as well, but not before I had taken very, very seriously the whole subject of mesmerism. And I'm just going to read you one more piece, which is when Cordelia, because she has the gift that her aunt had. Charles Dickens was a mesmerist. It's not a thing that is just a few people have, not at all. It's if you understand energy and it's going from one person to another and have that kind of concentration, you too could be a hypnotist. This was a great surprise to me. But I read an enormous, enormous amount, and this is based on what I read of what happens in hospitals. Cordelia becomes very famous as a mesmerist, not just as somebody who gives advice for the marriage night. And this is her first visit to a hospital. Now remember, there was no ether, there was no chloroform, they used saws, they used knives, they cut off legs and breasts. It was often amputations, and all there was brandy. One morning, Cordelia Preston was called urgently for the first time to the mesmeric infirmary. A woman about her own age was to be operated on to remove her breast, cancer. Somehow she'd heard of Cordelia and asked for this woman mesmerist to help her. Cordelia shook her head in great distress. I'm sorry, I'm not experienced enough, she said. But the woman stared up at her with huge, imploring eyes. I have heard of you, she said. They say I may die. Please stay with me. Cordelia's hands sweated. She felt cold. Her heart beat unpleasantly. I cannot watch this. I cannot go in there with the doctors. The doctors waited in their big aprons. The pale woman put out a thin, thin hand towards Cordelia. I give myself to your care, she said, whatever happens. Very slowly and with immense reluctance, Cordelia took off her hat, drew down her gloves, stared down at the pale, frightened face. She took a deep breath. She stood beside the woman and slowly passed her own arms downward, over and over, just above the white-gowned body, not touching her ever, not touching, her hands over and over. It took a very short time to put the pale, thin woman into a trance. Now then, said the doctors. Cordelia Preston stayed at the woman's side as they went into the operating room. The surgeon had a saw and a knife. There were people to hold the woman down. Somehow Cordelia did not scream. Several times, as the knife, cutting into the thin body, spurted blood, plenty of it getting on Cordelia's gown, the woman moaned. Cordelia passed her hands over and over, over and over, sweat pouring down her face from the effort and the heat of the room and the smell of so much blood, and sometimes the feeling of pain in her own breast. She breathed in deeply, passed her hands over and over, her eyes blank before what she could not help seeing, but she concentrated only on the face of the woman, on her pain, tried to pull away pain with the energy from herself and the movement of her hands. Finally, it was over. They bound the woman's body with bandages. Blood seeped through. Now they could give her laudanum to sleep. Cordelia Preston's heart still pumped blood faster and faster, and the ceiling spun about her. However, none of the Miss Prestons ever fainted. Now, that'll give you an idea of where my research took me. Nowhere where I expected to go. As I say, the book turns into a thriller because I couldn't resist the coroner's courts above the pubs. But at the basis of it all the time is this respect for mesmerism, which turns into hypnotism, and what it can do when it's used properly. I don't think I want to say any more, except I've just finished another book about something completely different, but my publishers in their wisdom have insisted that the next book I write takes these characters from all the things that happens to them. At the end of the book, they're just on the way to America, and they're going to get to America, and then I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I know a lot of psychic stuff was going on in America just at that time, so watch this space. Would anyone like to ask me any questions?
In your book, I got the impression you looked a bit into women and their position in society and how they could get anywhere on their own. And I wondered whether this profession of mesmerism was something quite widespread or not.
It was not widespread for women. The fact that there was that I found this Miss Preston in an actual medical textbook made me know that women had practiced it. So I knew that I was on something. But Cordelia is very unusual, which is why this woman asks her to come to the hospital. There was great arguments between doctors who didn't like to see their power taken away in any way. And the church, indeed, as you know, there's a scene where a bishop comes in and says, when our Lord did wonderful miracles, you cannot say that they were mesmerism, they were miracles. So the church was against it. The medical profession, a lot of the medical profession, not all, was against it. So it was of course, as soon as ether and chloroform were discovered, mesmerism really faded away, because that was a better way to put, a more reliable way, and the doctors could have it under control. No, there weren't many women. Yes, there were some. And of course, this started off as a joke, and they found themselves in this world despite themselves, i.e. despite me, because of what I found out. All my books I've noticed, all my historical novels do talk about how hard it was for women. In one book, a woman goes to New Zealand on a boat, which took 3 months, and a woman could not travel on her own, not in 1850 when things had got so difficult for women. Earlier, one of my heroines in Rosetta goes to Egypt. It was easier for women. Interestingly, it was easier for women around 1800 than it was in 1850. And I've chosen that period for most of my books for that very reason, because you see things changing for women for the worse. And so I'm kind of following that with my books. I'm not going to write historical novels forever, but the 4th one has just gone in, and the 5th one is going to be about whatever happens to these people. And then I might choose something entirely different. Anyone else want to?
when they do go to America, have you already started researching their life?
I've only just, a couple of weeks ago, handed in my fourth historical novel, which is set in the 18th century and is about portrait painting. So I've completely, in fact, because I'm talking to this in this next 2 weeks, I'm talking to all the libraries in Westminster about the Mesmerist. And I thought, I think I better read it again. So I was in New Zealand last week, and so on the flight back, I read The Mesmerist. And I'd even forgotten some little bits, because, of course, I've written a whole book since then. So, no, I can't tell you anything about what will happen, but something will happen. Yes?
Can you tell us anything about the book you have just finished?
Well, I can tell you a little bit. It's called The Fraud, and I set it in the 18th century, which was new for me, so I had to do a whole lot more research, and I got really carried away with the 18th century and how it was. But it's about painting, and it's set in the time of Joshua Reynolds and Gainsborough, and the time when painting was just becoming very, very important in England for men, of course. And all they looked back to was the past, the old masters, Michelangelo. You had to make the grand tour to go to Europe. And in the time that I'm writing about, I found that there was a movement towards another kind of painting, ending with Turner. I mean, he just comes in at the very, very end, and he does nothing like the portrait paintings. But why I was so interested was there were no photographs. Can we imagine this? All we know about people at that time is the paintings that were done. And I was just reading about Van Dyck, I think it was, who of course, wanted to impress and flatter the royal family that he was working for, and did beautiful paintings of them. We don't know what they really looked like. And when people started painting what people really looked like, people didn't like it. So there's a whole interesting area there. And of course there is a woman coming up who's trying to have a go. That's all I can say about that at the moment. Yes?
You said you don't plan to write historical novels forever. So what do you think?
Well, not all. I mean, the actresses that I was telling you about, that was set in the present day. When I wrote A Dangerous Vine, which was the one about 1950s New Zealand, it was nominated for the Orange Prize. And somebody said, it's very interesting to read this historical novel. And I nearly died because I thought I was alive. So, there are historical novels and historical novels. I just think, I don't want to repeat myself. I mean, I know my portrait one is completely different, my painting one, and the publishers have insisted that I follow Cordelia and Willie further. But after that, I don't want to repeat myself. I mean, I perhaps will do something else. I'm not sure. But I could write forever about what happens to women, but I could get boring, and I don't want to be boring. Yeah.
Are there any other periods in history perhaps you played a part, kind of set in the 17th century?
I can't hear you, sorry.
Are there any other periods in history that you would be keen to write about? Perhaps you played a part.
Oh, I see. Well, that's why I chose this period, not so much because a lot of the plays I was in were Victorian, because there's so many more Victorian plays, or, of course, Restoration, when you have all those mad people and mad costumes. But I think I've found, as I said earlier, I've found my period. I reckon from 1790 to about 1835. It's not a period that's been covered as much. I mean, there are a million Victorian novels, indeed by Victorians themselves. And so I was just trying to find a little area of my own, and particularly why women's lives changed. And that was what interested me so much. Their lives got worse. They got pushed back into the home. They were called the angel at the table and all that kind of stuff. But in 1800 and 1795, it wasn't quite like that. So in my research, I was interested to try and find out why. So I have to say that most of my costume plays were Victorian. But luckily I did do a few with hoops, and those hoops that people had to lift up and bend over. So I knew that you had to do that if you're going down a narrow corridor. But I think I've done that time now. I might go to the future now that I've been to Google and find it's not in the sky. Who knows?
Did you come to any conclusions why it got worse? Because I know from when you look at costumes, how in the 1800 you got the Muslim and the A-line. It's so free. In fact, women could be pregnant and very pregnant without anybody knowing. And then you get the costumes getting tighter and tighter and more restrictive.
Absolutely. You're onto it exactly. Why? I'm not sure that you want a big lecture about all that. That could take me ages. Well, in a nutshell, in a small nutshell, I'll only say this, and then if you're interested, you need to read my books, especially Rosetta, the one about Egypt, because that goes into it a lot. While I was writing Rosetta, it was clear to me that my character could go to Egypt. But I had just written a book where it was so difficult for my character to go to New Zealand by herself. And I thought, there's something wrong here. And I went to Egypt and had many, many adventures in Egypt. It was just, Bush was bombing Afghanistan. I mean, I didn't want to go to Egypt, but I felt I would be lying if I didn't go and kind of get the feel of the place. And there is an Egyptian writer called Adaf Sueif, who some of you might know. And I introduced myself to her and I said, I'm going to Egypt and I'd like to talk to somebody in Egypt about Egypt and about the history of Egypt. And she said, oh, my mother is emeritus professor of English at Cairo University, and I'll introduce you to her. So that was very interesting. And she talked to me about the town of Rosetta, which is actually called Rashid, and why it was so important. All sorts of interesting things I learned. And I liked her so much. Fatma Musa, her name was. She's dead. She died, unfortunately, since. And I told her about my problem. I said, I can't quite understand why things got so difficult. As you say, people were wearing freer costumes. They weren't having to wear constricting corsets, and they certainly weren't. They could go in a room with someone, with a man they weren't married to. By the time you come to 1850, you couldn't really go in a room with a man you weren't married to with the door closed. And I thought, it wasn't like that. And I leant across the table. I said to her, this is not what I've come to talk to you about, but I'm just telling you I've got this problem. And she was quite crippled with arthritis, and she was old then. And she leant across the table and she said to me, look to the church. And that's all she said. And then I looked about how the church was frightened after the French Revolution and how the royal family was frightened and how, I mean, it seems terrible to say it was the French Revolution's fault. But England was so frightened, I believe, that there would be a revolution. There very nearly was. And that their idea was women should be in the home and keeping and the church, everyone should go to church and all that. So she put me on by just saying those words. So I dedicated Rosetta to her for those, not only for what she told me about Egypt, but for what she told me, the line she sent me on. But I could speak for years about this and I won't. Are there any other questions? So I think I can stop.